Welcome on board for a journey full of beauty and nostalgia. A chance to sit back and soak up the views as we go in search of long-lost railways and the way of life that went with them. From the stunning narrow-gauge railways of North Wales to the secrets of Queen Victoria's long-lost railway near Balmoral. We travel by train to the most spectacular scenery the British Isles has to offer. So sit back and enjoy Britain's most beautiful lost railways. The railways were arguably the greatest invention of the 19th century, completely transforming the lives of ordinary people in the United Kingdom and eventually around the world. But just over a century later, the country that invented railways just couldn't make them pay. The man blamed for the eventual loss of a third of our railway network was Dr. Richard Beeching. The government asked him to balance the books, and he ended up making savage cuts. In the next hour, we'll be heading to the most remote and spectacular railways in the British Isles, the ones most at risk from Dr. Beeching's axe. We'll be exploring the stunning scenery of the Scottish Highlands for traces of Queen Victoria's long-lost line. And climbing aboard a steam-hauled special on the West Highland line which, despite the odds, survived Dr. Beeching's attempts to close it. We're heading into the spectacular mountain scenery of North Wales to discover how a world-famous narrow-gauge railway was lost, even before Beeching, but was reborn thanks to the efforts of armies of volunteers. And travelling on England's most remote and beautiful line from Settle to Carlisle, looking for reminders of the navvies who built so many of our remote railways by hand. It would be wrong to lay all the blame at Dr. Beeching's door. Between the wars, over 1,200 miles of track had already been closed by railway companies who just couldn't make the lines pay. In 1946, one of the most famous railways in the world became a lost line, the Ffestiniog narrow-gauge railway in North Wales. Few other railways have had such a direct connection with the landscape they run through. In the 1830s, it was the huge demand for slate quarried in the mountains of Snowdonia that led to the building of a railway in the first place. What quicker way for the slate companies to get hundreds of tons of roofing material down from the hills? The slate industry's long gone, but today the spectacular scenery attracts over 200,000 tourists a year to the former mineral line, contributing over £9 million to the North Wales economy. It's a booming tourist attraction, but things couldn't have been more different in the late 1940s. The narrow-gauge tracks were abandoned and overgrown. Its fleet of steam locomotives rusting away. Whole trains of trucks and coaches left to rot in their sidings. We'll discover how the railway was saved from extinction a little later, but the real story of this remarkable railway starts even further back in time, with slate. The Romans were the first to quarry slate from the mountains of Wales. By the 1790s, it was being exported on a fairly small scale into mainland Europe. In those days, slate from the mines above Ffestiniog was carried down the mountain on carts or sleds, loaded into small boats and taken offshore where it was loaded onto ocean-going ships.
In those days, of course, there was no railway to take the slates down to the sea at Porthmadog. So first of all, they had to use pack horses, and then they built cart roads. Little carts took the slates down to the tidal waters of the River Dwyrid, and they were put into small boats there, and then men would row them or sail them down the river and out into the open sea, and they would put the slates on seagoing ships there. So it was a very time-consuming, slow, expensive process. And by the beginning of the 19th century, people were looking for a more cost-effective way of making sure that the slates at least the first stage of the journey.
As the towns of the Industrial Revolution grew, so did the demand for cheap roofing material, and the quarrying companies needed a more efficient way to get their slate to the port, so the owners of the railway opted for steam locomotives.
Steam locomotives were, of course, nothing new by the time the Ffestiniog Railway introduced them in 1863. Now, the Ffestiniog has always had quite a talent for publicity, and it really shouted from the rooftops when the locomotives were introduced. The locomotives, the initial ones, weren't even particularly reliable. They weren't particularly innovative. But what they did do was enable the railway to make that leap from a mineral tramway into a small but fully fledged contemporary railway.
This had a massive impact on the efficiency of the line and the amount of slate it could carry, therefore the amount of money it could earn. So the steam engines worked the empty wagons up to the top of the line. But still, because it was built on a continuous gradient, there was still gravity working. It was literally just the loaded wagons coming down from the quarries in the mountains down to the harbour at the sea.
Remarkably, nearly a century and a half later, one of those first steam engines, Prince, still runs on the Ffestiniog today. But by the 1860s, with demand for slate at an all-time high, even the little locos couldn't handle the volume of slate traffic. For a while, the railway company considered the expensive option of doubling the track, but a solution appeared in the form of inventor Robert Francis Fairlie and his steam locomotive that was effectively two locos in one.
Now, a double Fairlie looks like two ordinary steam locomotives joined back to back on one long frame, but one important difference is that the wheels are a sort of swivelling sub-assembly, which means that the locomotive can go around quite sharp corners, and there are plenty of those in the Ffestiniog Railway, but it's also twice as powerful as an ordinary locomotive, but can be operated by one crew. So, in 1869, the first of these, with the wonderful name of the Little Wonder, arrived on the Ffestiniog Railway. It wasn't the very first double Fairlie locomotive by any means. They'd been trialled on a number of other railways, and you can trace the design back a good many years. But again, the Ffestiniog publicity machine moved into action, and everybody was invited to come to the Ffestiniog Railway to see these wonderful new machines in action and to see the sort of trains that they could pull up the gradients. One of the things that the Fairlie locomotive enabled the railway's engineer, Charles Easton Spooner, to do was to really move the publicity machine into overdrive. He, I'm sure, was hoping to get some juicy contracts to build narrow gauge railways, preferably with Fairlie locomotives in other parts of the world. And Robert Francis Fairlie, who devised the locomotive, had a talent for publicity every bit as good as Mr. Spooner. So they got the great and the good of the railway world to come and visit the Ffestiniog Railway. People came from Russia, people came from the Indian Railways Commission, people came from America. The United States went railway mad, narrow gauge railway mad, and Ffestiniog clones were built in places like Colorado, they were built in India, quite literally, I suppose, from China to Peru. You see railways that have been influenced by the Ffestiniog Railway.
Fairlie locomotives still provide the pulling power on the Ffestiniog Railway today, climbing, twisting and turning along 13.5 miles of restored track. From the windows of the miniature carriages, you can rediscover links with the railway's past. Most journeys begin at Porthmadog, and the railway station is close to the quayside that once thronged with ships carrying Welsh slate all over the world. Most of the quayside warehouses have long been lost, but the Ship Public House provides an echo of its seafaring heyday. As today's trains leave the station, they cross over the Cobb, a 3/4 of a mile embankment that was built in 1811. Its creation changed the currents in the river, effectively gouging out a deep channel to the harbour.
Creating a harbour was one of the ways in which the export of slate became a more cost-effective process, because it did mean that small wooden sailing ships could come into the harbour instead of the slate having to be transported from barges into ships effectively in the middle of the open sea. So that meant that it created a port town, the town of Porthmadog or Porthmadog, and that became a very distinctive little Welsh community, which it remains to this day.
As the trains leave the Cobb, they pass the site of the quarry that supplied the thousands of tons of stone to build it. It's now called Boston Lodge and is the home of the Ffestiniog's workshops, where they restore, maintain and build carriages of locomotives.
Here at Boston Lodge Works on the Ffestiniog Railway, we've got skills and experience going back decades, both with the staff and the volunteers. So we maintain and build all our own engines here. So people come from miles around to use these skills. We do work not only for this railway, but for railway workshops and other places all around the area and all around the world. We've got about 15 or 16 engines here. That incorporates the steam ones and also some diesel ones which run at the quiet times. That's quite a large amount for a railway of this size, but it includes the original Ffestiniog Railway engines and ones that we've successfully brought in and made to work for the Ffestiniog Railway.
Minforth is the place to disembark if you want to visit Portmeirion, the unique village that's featured in the 60s Prisoner TV series, but it's a 2-mile walk from the station. Minforth also has a reminder of how tough village life could be in the 19th century. The Bronwgarth Hospital was originally built as a workhouse. It cost £3,200, had 150 inmates, exercise yards and a mortuary. Just as it was in horse-drawn days, much of today's railway is single track, and up and down trains have to pass each other in double-track passing loops, like the one at Rue Goch or Red Bank Station. Here, the driver is picking up a token or key, which he must have before he can go on to the next single-track section. It's a simple device to stop two trains ever being on the same track at the same time. Further up the line, this impressive house was once home to the Oakley family, owners of the largest slate quarries in the district. And Clynmere, or Mary's Lake, also has a connection with the Oakleys. It was given to Mary, one of the daughters at the big house, as a 21st birthday present. Ffestiniog, which translates as under the pass, is 430 feet above sea level. At 7 miles from Porthmadog, it's about halfway on the journey up the mountains. locomotives have to slow down as they approach Garneth Tunnel. Dug out for the original horse-drawn railway, it's only just wide enough for the train, not the place to stick your head out of the window. Once clear of the tunnel, the train heads through the Wood of the Wolves. This remote location was chosen for holidays by British Nazi sympathiser William Joyce, infamously known as Lord Haw Haw, and the family of spy Kim Philby. As the railway reaches Fields, it approaches the only railway spiral in Britain, where the line climbs steeply and doubles back over itself to gain height in a short distance. It also marks the spot where the trains leave the original route, because 2.5 miles of track and a tunnel were flooded while the Ffestiniog was a lost railway.
The slate industry had been in decline since about 1898, but in 1914 we went to war with the Ffestiniog slate industry's best customer, Germany. Of course, that trade had to come to an end, and it never revived after 1918. Generally, the market for slate grew less. There were more and more flat-roofed buildings being erected. There were more and more tile-roofed buildings being erected. People didn't want to know about this traditional roofing material. Now, the railway company made great efforts to build up tourist trade, and they were successful in this to some extent, but the era of mass tourism hadn't arrived by the 1930s. 1939, the passenger traffic was taken off the railway. It reverted to being what it had been in 1836, a purely mineral railway. There wasn't a great deal of demand for slate during the war, so the little narrow gauge railway really had no purpose left, and in 1946 it closed down.
A little later we'll be continuing our journey up the mountains on the new stretch of track that was created, against all odds, by a band of dedicated enthusiasts who were determined that the Ffestiniog would be brought back to life. In 1925 there had been about 120 independent railway companies, like the Ffestiniog, across Britain. But only 23 years later, in 1948, there was one, British Rail. It inherited over 20,000 steam locomotives and about 19,000 miles of track. Laid end to end, the lines would have stretched 3/4 of the way around the Earth. But due to chronic lack of investment and monumental effort during World War II, the newly nationalised network was in no condition to take on growing competition from the lorry and the motor car.
The railways were really worn out in the 1940s. There were more accidents than there had been before. They suffered from more breakdowns. There was a terrible winter of 1947 where there was a coal shortage. They used bad coal, which then led to more breakdowns. They became unreliable. And indeed, the government minister at the time said of the railways that they were a disgrace. And they were in such a terrible state. And that was really a result of underinvestment, not their own fault.
It was the remote railways of Britain that appeared the most vulnerable when the government asked Dr. Richard Beeching to come up with a plan to make the railways commercially viable. In 1963, he produced his now infamous report, The Reshaping of British Railways. Not all of his recommendations were carried out, but by the end of the 1960s, 4,000 stations had closed and 6,000 miles of track, around a third of the network, was ripped up. Sleepers and signals were sawn up for fence posts, and whole sections of track were taken away for scrap. Scotland in particular lost enormous numbers of branch lines. One of the high-profile casualties was the line through some of the most picturesque scenery in the Scottish Highlands. The Royal Deeside line skirted the north bank of the River Dee from Aberdeen inland to Ballater, the closest station to Balmoral Castle. For Queen Victoria, it was the final stage of her long journey for summer holidays at Balmoral aboard the Royal Train.
Queen Victoria was the monarch that really started travelling in a big way. The railway companies were quite keen as a kind of promotion activity to provide royal trains. The West Coast route up to Scotland was the one that she usually used. There were various things that had to be done. It's quite surprising, in fact, the levels of security that were in place even then. Always a locomotive was sent on ahead of the train to ensure that the track was clear and that railway gates were all closed and padlocked. And there was a threat even of terrorism, bombs, explosions in those days, and they were very conscious of that. So, you know, this is nothing new that's happened in later years. Queen Victoria would have taken all her staff with her, and the journey, of course, from Windsor to Balmoral took probably 2 days, and therefore they'd have to have sleeping accommodation on the train. So we're talking substantial lengths of trains, maybe 12 coaches, something like that. She had very strict discipline for the drivers. When she moved originally, she had 2 coaches separated by one of the first corridor connections between 2 separate coaches, and while she was passing between the coaches, she asked the train to slow down to a relatively slow speed, so she didn't feel unsteady on her feet. She had the train running as she wished. Certainly the Royal Train took priority over normal train services. It was quite normal for a local train service to be shunted into a siding and left while they waited for the Royal Train to pass. That would be quite normal.
Ballater Station, some 42 miles from Aberdeen, was the end of the line. It would have gone further, but Queen Victoria was not amused at the prospect of tourists getting any closer to her summer retreat, so put a stop to a proposed extension. Today, the Highland terminus is a popular tourist attraction, with visitors flocking in to explore its royal connections. Victoria was the first royal to use the Deeside line in 1866. Since then, it's seen a steady stream of royal family members, like Princes Albert and Edward and the late King Edward VII. Pat Crawford has been connected with Ballater Station all her life.
I remember the late King. The schools always got out when the royal family arrived, and the crowds were outside the station there waiting on the royal train coming in. And the Guard of Honour, which is made up of a regiment of soldiers, were formed outside, and the pipe band as well. And when they came out, the late King and the present Queen, they inspected the Guard of Honour and before they went on their journey up to Balmoral. Queen Victoria's Day, it was horse and carriage, I believe, outside waiting on them. But no, I remember Prince Charles and Princess Anne as little ones coming out with their nanny outside the station door.
The station didn't just see Royal Rail passengers. Some of the world's most influential VIPs disembarked here before heading on to visit the royals at Balmoral.
Winston Churchill, I remember coming through. Whoever is Prime Minister at the time comes for a weekend when the royal family are in residence at Balmoral. Seen Mr. Wilson, Harold Wilson, seen him, Tony Blair. Haven't seen the present Prime Minister, but seen the others.
After a short spell away from Ballater, Pat returned to work for the local council. Her office was on the station in the original waiting room built for Queen Victoria.
Some people would say I had the best office in Aberdeenshire. In the 80s, Queen Elizabeth II visited us and came into the royal waiting room, and she said to me she didn't realise that the waiting room had been kept in such a good condition. She was amazed and very pleased to see that the condition it was in.
Today, Pat's office has been restored to how it would have been when Queen Victoria was a frequent visitor to the station. Much of it is original, including maple panelling, which was a gift to the Queen from the Canadian government. But the most recent addition to the station is an exact replica of Queen Victoria's Railway Day carriage, in which she travelled on her long journeys from Windsor.
It is fully furbished, just exactly as the original one was. The blue shades on the top of the roof are for shading the lights, I believe, when they wanted the lights dimmed. She sat there during the day, but at night they stopped the carriages and moved to the bedroom carriage. She didn't sleep in the adjoining rooms. As you go in, on the left, there's a little door, which would have been her toilet, and at the far side on the right is her servants' quarters.
There's no doubt that Queen Victoria loved her annual visits to Deeside and Balmoral. She wrote in her journal, "Every year my heart becomes more fixed on this dear paradise." Today, rail enthusiasts dream of opening up large sections of this lost line, much of which is a cycleway. One of the most beautiful locations on the route is at Canvas-o-May. An elegant suspension bridge crosses the River Dee. It's a popular place for bathing and picnics. A tiny station was opened nearby in 1876, and in those days, directors of the Great North of Scotland Railway Company used to hold weekend board meetings in a saloon car, shunted into a siding among the silver birches. Today, the disused station is a private house. The station buildings at Aboyne are now shops, and the nearby tunnel has long been boarded up. The other major engineering feature on the line is the Belty Viaduct, but this was dismantled in 1989. So far, a mile of track has been brought back to life at Crathis Castle, and there are firm plans to reinstate a further 2 miles of the line. Even on this relatively short section of the Deeside Railway, visitors can still get a direct connection with the line's more recent royal passengers. It's this, a once futuristic battery-powered rail car. In 1958, this experimental train was affectionately nicknamed the Sputnik, after the first Earth-orbiting satellite that had been launched by the Russians in the previous year. In the late 50s, British Rail were exploring ways of making loss-making lines less of a financial burden. Scotland was rich with schemes for hydroelectric power stations to make low-cost electricity. So BR converted one of its familiar rail cars to run on chargeable batteries, all 15 tons of them. The rail-bound Sputnik ran for 60 miles on a full charge, and as it's 42 miles from Aberdeen to Ballater, it had to be plugged into the mains for at least an hour at each end of the line to charge it up again. The royals were not inconvenienced, however. The late Queen Mother regularly sat in this seat in first class, often travelling with the young Prince Charles and Princess Anne. But finally, even the royal connection didn't protect the Deeside Railway against Dr. Beeching's axe, and the last passenger train ran on the 28th of February 1966. If Dr. Beeching had had his way, a line on the west coast of Scotland would also have been lost forever, but it survives as one of the great railway journeys of the world. This is the West Highland line that travels through some of the most spectacular scenery in Britain, from Fort William, which is over 100 miles northwest of Glasgow, to the remote fishing port of Mallaig on the west coast. For the last 26 years, steam trains have been back on the line, carrying thousands of tourists and making a massive contribution to the economy of this isolated and beautiful part of Scotland. It's a line of extremes that takes travellers past Britain's highest mountain and its deepest loch. We can enjoy it today because back in the 60s, political pressure saved it. The railway reached Fort William from Glasgow in 1894, but its promoters knew they had 40 more miles to go through dramatic and inhospitable terrain to reach the fertile fishing grounds on the Minch Strait, the stretch of water that separates the Isle of Skye from the Hebrides. Before the railway arrived in Mallaig, the fishing community's best transport connection anywhere was by sea. There was a mail coach from Mallaig to Fort William 3 times a week, but it said the journey took 7.5 hours. A railway was the answer, but building it through this remote and rugged landscape was extremely difficult.
When the railway was being built, the contractor Robert McAlpine, his son was seriously injured in a blasting accident in Loch Highland. The surgeon, who was called from Glasgow at the time, when he arrived in Fort William at 5 a.m. in the morning, it took him rushing 7 hours to get to Loch Highland. So that's the sort of timing we're talking about, yes. Remember, 28 miles of the 40 miles. It's a very steep gradient, up to 1 in 50, and the bends were extremely tight. But possibly the most difficult thing was the hardness of the rock. Normally viaducts would have been built in rock, but here it was impossible to dress it, and so instead they crushed it and used it to pour into the concrete to reinforce it.
Today, modern diesel trains provide a regular passenger service from Fort William to Mallaig, but like most tourists, we're exploring this beautiful railway from on board the steam-hauled Jacobite service. Our journey starts at Fort William, the largest town on the West Highland line. As it heads west, the landscape of lochs and hills seem rather gentle, easing the passengers and the locomotive into what's to come. But it isn't long before the scenery becomes dramatic, and the track full of sharp bends and steep inclines, really stretching the restored steam locos. Many of the proposed cuttings on the line ended up being tunnels, because they involved having to dig out less of the incredibly hard rock. Eventually, there were 11 tunnels on the 40-mile line, what have become the most famous landmarks, 6 viaducts, all of them made of concrete.
It was relatively new. Robert McAlpine had already earned his name as Concrete Bob by the time he started building this line, but it had been sort of piecemeal. He had been using it for minor constructions, whereas on this line he had to use it as his main material, mainly due to the hardness of the rock on the line.
About 20 miles out of Fort William, the Jacobite crosses the most spectacular structure on the West Highland line, the world-famous Glenfinnan Viaduct. This spectacular structure carries the track in a curve over the head of the River Finnan Valley, It's 416 yards long and has 21 elegant arches, the tallest of which is over 100 feet high. When the viaduct was completed, the official handbook for the line noted, "Many authorities on matters of taste declared when this viaduct was first proposed that it would prove a monstrosity sufficient in ugliness to take away all the charm and beauty of the scene." However, that's not how people see it today.
The most extraordinary thing about Glenfinnan Viaduct is its elegance, its sheer elegance. It looks incredible. It's actually what made me come to Glenfinnan. I was on my way to Mallaig on the train, and it was a very misty day, a bit like this, and the mist just lifted as I passed Glenfinnan Viaduct, and I was blown away with the beauty of it and decided to get off in Glenfinnan and met my husband at the station.
The viaduct is a movie star featuring in numerous films, most famously when Harry Potter flew over it in a magic car.
Harry Potter is a phenomenon in itself, has been going for many years, and the Glenfinnan Viaduct has featured repeatedly there. It has certainly brought in an awful lot of people. The steam train was used during filming, and these days we get regularly 300 people a day on the steam train. It's always full. So yes, it's good news for the railway and for everyone along the railway that earn their living from the tourist industry. Half the world comes up to the station asking for the Harry Potter bridge these days, which is quite extraordinary when crowds of Japanese people come asking for the Harry Potter bridge. But it has also been used in other films, like the Charlotte Gray film, which focused on the line's importance during wartime. The SOE, the Special Operations Executive, took use of all the big mansions in the area and used it for training the special agents. And that was very much featured in the film of Charlotte Gray, with, again, obviously, the filmmakers being captivated by that evocative viaduct in Glenfinnan.
On completion, the Glenfinnan Viaduct was one of the biggest unreinforced concrete structures in the world. Hundreds of joiners were employed to make the wooden frames of the piers and arches and cover them with planking to form a kind of mould. Then, thousands of tons of concrete were poured inside. When it set, the timber panels were removed, but you can still see their imprint in the concrete today. Folklore has it that during construction, a horse, cart and its driver fell inside one of the vast piers while tipping rubble. There was no way of rescuing them, and they remained entombed in the concrete to this day.
Oral history tends to be, it's based on truth and fact, and then it's slightly adjusted for effect when you tell the story. Now, it turns out, through measurements made by the Institute of Civil Engineers, and with the use of X-ray technology, they found that, well, there isn't actually a horse and cart in Glenfinnan Viaduct. They really tried very hard to find it, but they found it somewhere else. They found it in Lochnanuam Viaduct, which has a very wide central pier, and there is speculation that the reason why there is this big central pier is that it was meant to be an arch, but because of the horse and cart, they cemented it up.
A short distance after the viaduct, the Jacobite steams into Glenfinnan station to a traditional Highland welcome. Hundreds of tourists pack onto this remote station. A few get a chance to visit its tiny museum. But it isn't long before they're back on board and heading west again. The train soon reaches Arisaig, a station with a claim to fame. It's the most westerly railway station on the British mainland, even though you might expect to find that in Cornwall. On clear days, it also provides travellers with their first glimpse of the sea. Journey's End is the fishing town of Mallaig, which, when the railway reached it in 1901, was transformed from a sleepy fishing community to a bustling port. At its height, thousands of tons of fish were landed here, and the trains rushed the fresh catches inland to Fort William, Glasgow and beyond.
In its heyday, 19 trains a day, some of them reeking with fish. Many young people older people who used to live here at the time, they say that the smell of the trains is something you really don't forget.
The extension to the West Highland line was built on budget and slightly ahead of schedule, mainly because by the turn of the 20th century, railway contractors had plenty of experience of tackling this kind of terrain, and the whole process had become highly mechanised. But only 25 years earlier, it was a very different story. We're heading to England's most beautiful and remote railway, the last in Britain to be built by hand, by navvies, the magnificent line from Settle to Carlisle. From the comfort of a carriage, it's hard to connect with the massive human effort and loss of life that went into creating lines like this through wild and inhospitable countryside.
Settle and Carlisle was really a pretty crazy railway. This is a railway that really goes from pretty much the middle of nowhere to a small town up north, through 70-odd miles of bleak territory where even today hardly anybody lives, and certainly nobody much lived then.
The navvies who built it were itinerant labourers, named after the navigators who built the canals a century earlier. An astonishing 6,000 of them worked on the Settle to Carlisle line in some of the bleakest terrain in the country and some of the worst weather Britain could throw at them.
It took a good year or two to become a navvy from just being recruited off the streets or off the land, as it were. They had to build up their muscle. They had to be able to dig out a certain amount of soil every day before they, qualified for navvy status. And they had to play hard. They were often paid in the local pub, and so often they would just go on benders. They were paid on a Saturday, and they would then just spend much of their wages there and then. With the rest of it, they probably had to buy food in the company's shop, which charged them great excess amounts of money. So, in a way, the company was paying them and getting the money back, but getting a railway in the process.
The line was built by the Midland Railway Company to be its own high-speed route to Scotland. Allowing express trains to travel fast created massive engineering challenges. Curves had to be gentle, so locos didn't have to slow down, and gradients had to be no more than 1 in 100. In total, 14 tunnels and 22 viaducts had to be built to meet these demands. Engineering brilliance allowed the line to climb to Dent at 1,150 feet, the highest mainline station in Britain, where weather conditions can be treacherous. Fences built from sleepers are designed to stop the line being blocked by drifting snow. Creating the Blee Moor Tunnel involved digging and blasting over 2,600 yards through solid rock. It It's said to have accounted for a third of the cost of the entire 70-mile line and involved a massive loss of life.
Death occurred in various ways. I suppose really the nastiest ones were the ones that took place in Bleemore Tunnel, because there they were using a new form of explosive called dynamite. People were very careless with the use of it. They used to warm it up beside a fire or in the pockets before using it. The worst cases were where somebody would leave a little bit of dynamite in a crevice in the rock rather than take it out, and somebody would come along and bash and promptly blow his hands off. And so, you know, the deaths and maiming was particularly bad in Bleemore Tunnel, but it took place everywhere, of course. All the jobs had a measure of difficulty and danger.
But the engineering masterpiece of the line is undoubtedly the Ribblehead Viaduct.
The only picture I know which has got any shanty huts on it is a quite famous picture of the viaduct at a half stage of development. In the background there are little huts. Now these were rather special little huts. Most of the huts were rather plain, but in this case they've got little porches. The people who lived at Belgravia were probably, you know, the more or less the supervisors and the rest of it. But the other shanty towns had curious names. Some of them were biblical. You could go up to Jericho and then climb up to Jerusalem.
For most navvies, conditions in these shanties were poor, and when drink was flowing, often lawless and dangerous.
Drink, of course, fired up the navvies to the extent that they went out and committed virtually every crime in the book. The local magistrates at Ingleton, I mean, they were perpetually sitting on cases where people had been fighting, had stolen things. You mentioned a crime and it was there to be discussed and dealt with, and it was dealt with very harshly indeed. The House of Correction at Wakefield, that was where the worst of the cases were to be sent. The Bradford City Mission sent in a missionary. Just imagine a missionary coming to Yorkshire, but there it was. And he opened up a little room there. They had a harmonium and they had special services. They had a Sunday school eventually, and they also organised little Saturday evening concerts for the people. So, you know, I mean, there was that little bit about it as well. And of course, this being Victorian times, no work was done on a Sunday. So on a Sunday you could either go to chapel or you could go and watch a bit of bare-fisted fighting somewhere else, because that was another popular occupation.
The navvies completed the Ribblehead Viaduct in 1875, an extraordinary structure that, due to its location, has to stand up to some of the worst weather in the Yorkshire Dales.
I got a godfather who used to drive one of those locomotives, and he said when he got to Ribblehead on a really windy day, the thing was to just see that things were going well and then snuddle down behind whatever shelter you could until you got across the viaduct. They could stand up properly again.
While the viaduct may survive as a testament to the navvies' hard work, the church at Chapel the Frith, only a few miles from Ribblehead, is a more sobering reminder of the navvies' sacrifice. There are around 200 navvy graves, most of them unmarked. One grave is that of James Mather, who ran the beer house at Batty Green. He was crushed under the wheels of a wagon in May 1872, only months after 2 of his children died, we assume from disease. The verse that's difficult to make out on his headstone reflects, "No man in this world need boast of his might. He's alive in the morning and dead at night."
And also there was that little infusion of a thing called smallpox at one stage, which led to the building of a hospital. And there was a sad little procession of people now and again going down to Chapel-le-Dale Church for a funeral. I think the most telling story was of the man who went down there. He'd lost 2 infant children, and the parson didn't turn up. Must have got the wrong date. And so this man actually dug the grave, buried the children, and then intoned a few prayers, then came sorrowfully back up to his home. You can hardly believe that sort of thing.
In 1874, when the line was nearing completion, 2 musical evenings were held at the Batty Green Mission to raise money for this marble tablet to remember all the navvies who died through accidents on the line. You need to search among the tombstones to find a more modern memorial. Erected in Millennium Year, it commemorates everyone who died during the construction of the railway, men, women and children whose names have been lost. Despite its remoteness, the Settle to Carlisle line survived the Beeching cuts of the 1960s, only to face a full-on battle for its survival 20 years later. The fact that it wasn't lost is entirely down to a vociferous campaign group, the Friends of the Settle to Carlisle line.
It was uneconomic. Cynics might have did say at the time, that it was being closed by stealth. If you divert the traffic away from any railway line, it becomes uneconomic. And at its nadir, this railway line just had 2 trains a day, 72 miles from Settle to Carlisle, 22 viaducts, 14 tunnels, colossally expensive to maintain for just 2 inconveniently timed trains a day, and no freight whatever. It had been run down so much. The Ribblehead Viaduct certainly was a major obstacle to the line staying open, or so it was said at the time. As you see, it's still there, large as life, and they say better now than when the Midland Railway built it in the early 1870s. But yes, it was said to be in need of replacement, not just repair.
But perhaps because they'd seen the impact of cuts made by Beeching in the 1960s, the Friends of the Settle to Carlisle were determined to make sure this remarkable railway survived.
It was a very dignified campaign. It wasn't a violent campaign. It was a very well conducted, politely conducted campaign, and that was effective. It was also a media campaign. No opportunity was lost to put the Settle to Carlisle. I mean, nobody's heard of Settle. Everybody's heard of Carlisle, probably. But Settle, where on earth is that? And people really wouldn't know of Settle if it wasn't for this railway line, by and large, and I speak as a Settle resident there. I feel able to say that. But the best, for instance, I can think of is when petitions were being got up and objectors were signing up, we got a dog's paw print among the objectors, a dog called Russup, whose paw print was accepted as a valid objector to closure of this railway line. He was at that time a fare-paying passenger. I believe dogs go free now. And so that hit the headlines in a minor sort of way at the time, but it put it on the national agenda. Only recently we've unveiled a statue to Russup at Garsdale Station, near to the summit of the line. And when we were fundraising for that statue, I know the appeal appeared in the China Daily and the Times of India. To this day, this railway line it's on the world stage. Since the Settle to Carlisle line was reprieved from closure, there hasn't been, so far as I'm aware, any significant rail closures on the agenda in this country.
The Settle to Carlisle campaigners have the immense satisfaction that they were proved right. Today, the line is booming. It's a highly popular tourist route and heavily used by walkers who want access to the stunning landscapes of the Yorkshire Dales. And in complete contrast to the situation when closure was threatened, it's a booming freight route too, with trains running 24 hours every day except Christmas Day. And whenever there are problems on the east or west coast main lines between London and Scotland, it provides a very useful diversionary route. The Settle to Carlisle line undoubtedly owes its survival to campaigners who fought hard to stop it becoming a lost line. But reviving a railway that's already been lost involves even greater effort, and no bunch of railway enthusiasts had a tougher job than those who decided to rescue the Ffestiniog Railway in North Wales.
By the late 1940s, the railway was becoming very overgrown. The locomotives were locked away in the shed and they were becoming rusty. And the whole railway was like a sleeping beauty, really, that wanted somebody to wake it up. Attitudes to heritage changed quite considerably. It became clear that the old-fashioned mineral railway, country railway, the steam railway even, didn't have very much longer to go. Things were going to change. There was something very appealing about this fussy little narrow gauge railway in a very beautiful part of the world. What also made a big difference was that people had more spare time after the war. People had weekends. People didn't, as much, have to go into work on Saturday mornings. If you wanted to pile into a car or get on a train on a Friday evening, leave your house or flat in London or Birmingham or wherever it might be, and come up to North Wales to dig out a siding or polish up a rusty locomotive, well, you could do that, and that's what happened.
In 1951, only 5 years after it closed, a band of railway enthusiasts, something of a rare breed in those times, was beginning to think about restoring and reopening the derelict and overgrown line. In 1954, they gained control of the line and started the massive job of restoration.
Everything had overgrown, there were trees in the track, and it really was in a very poor state of repair. The locomotive works and all the carriages had just been left where they were when it closed, and so there was a lot of work to be done even to run the first train.
People used to come from all over the country every weekend and in their holidays, take off their suits, put on their old clothes and their boots and dig away at the mountain and dig cuttings for the trains and build embankments, build bridges. And as the project developed, there was some paid work, but the majority was done simply by volunteers and muscle power.
Their early successes were dealt a massive blow in 1963 when the Central Electricity Generating Board commissioned a new hydroelectric power station in the mountains. The project involved flooding a huge area of countryside to create a reservoir. In the process, a large section of the disused railway track and the Molwyn Railway Tunnel were flooded too. They could never be used by trains again. If the restored railway was to reach its original terminus at Ffestiniog, it would need an all-new alternative route, a deviation. Despite having no money, and not even owning the land they wanted to build the new track on, the enthusiasts forged ahead and became known as the Deviationists. There were fears that the whole project would take 35 years.
Much fun was made on we were deviants, but I tried to get an advert, I remember, to recruit deviationists in the Manchester Evening News, and wrote to the copy for the advert saying, "Come for a dirty weekend in North Wales," and they wouldn't publish it. But it's very poor, because it's true. You did have a dirty weekend, very dirty. But it was good fun, fresh air, healthy.
The railway enthusiasts decided on what seemed like the impossible, to build a new 2.5-mile deviation line to bypass the reservoir. The first challenge was to raise the railway above the level of the water, and that was done by creating Britain's only railway spiral, where the track climbs sharply, doubling back on itself.
It was a difficult task to build the spiral because of the remote location, and people used to come from all over the country to volunteer. They were known as the Deviationists. Many of them were students at college. They came from all different walks of life. They came and stayed actually in a mess miles and miles from anywhere. They used to go down in wagons to it. They used to have all their own facilities there, and they used to come up and work really hard at the weekends, and it was really down to a lot of labour.
The Deviationists had another engineering challenge. The new route involved digging a brand new tunnel over 280 feet through solid Welsh rock.
The biggest challenge was the rock. Hard stuff, very hard stuff. Some was easy, you just hit it and it split and you dug it out. Some was very, very hard, just sheer physical labour. We did have a shot blaster, an explosive expert, to come and blast for us, and we drilled the holes and he did the blasting. But the most difficult part was physically moving the stuff. In the end, we realised we needed an excavator to help us, and we collected green shield stamps to buy an excavator. And a huge appeal. The green shield stamps flooded in, but in the end someone took pity on us and gave us an excavator before we collected nearly enough. But they were useful. There were injuries, naturally. I had a broken finger, it's still a bit funny. I've got scars on my leg I won't show you. And we had some people had some quite bad breaks. But no one was seriously injured. We all survived and we all loved it.
The deviation starts at the new loop, which lifts the railway above water level, and it isn't long before trains plunge into the deviationists' new tunnel. Today, passengers emerging from the new tunnel on the deviation line can still see traces of the original route, providing the water levels in the reservoir are low. The mouth of the original, now blocked off tunnel can be seen from the carriage window, as can a short section of the old track bed on the reservoir floor. Behind the power station, the railway crosses the massive penstock pipes which feed water into the turbines on a bridge that's buried beneath the track. Shortly after passing the hydroelectric plant, the deviation ends and the railway rejoins the old track bed at Tanigristar station. Then it's not far to Ffestiniog, the town that became the centre of Snowdonia's slate industry and was known as the town that roofed the world. The Ffestiniog was one of the earliest heritage lines. Now Britain has over 100.
Many of those heritage lines would have been lost if it hadn't been for far-sighted enthusiasts who, even as the lines were being closed in the 60s, knew deep in their heart that something important was disappearing. Luckily they had the vision, nerve and stamina for the battles that were often needed to bring those lost lines back to life.
We have a whole host of heritage railways where often volunteers have worked for years and years and years, got a bit of line going, and then maybe got another bit of line, and they've bought a locomotive and kept it going with a fantastic amount of work, and amazingly popular. People love travelling on these. Even people who are far too young to have ever travelled on a steam railway in their youth, and would never have seen one. And I think that's because there is a belated recognition of just how important this invention was.
Someone once said that the steam engine is the nearest thing that man has made to a living being. It's got so many different moods to it. When it's going uphill, it's working hard, and it tells you that. It barks loudly. When it's going downhill, it's more comfortable. It purrs almost like a cat. When you get to the destination, the train sort of comes to a stand, and you can almost hear from the sort of sound of the steam escaping, it's almost saying, I did it. Gosh, thank goodness that's over. So there's these different moods with the steam engine. Now, people might laugh at that and smile when you say it, but I think it appeals to children. It also, they might not be so ready to admit it, it also appeals to grown-ups as well.
The mecca for today's rail enthusiasts is the National Railway Museum in York. The collection, housed on the site of a long-lost local depot, attracts 800,000 visitors a year and has everything from giant locomotives and original royal carriages to a lock of George Stephenson's hair.
The National Museum ended up here. It was a decision made by Margaret Thatcher when she was Minister of Science and Education back in 1970. Basically, the collection needed a home. It had lost its home in Clapham. It was given to the Science Museum. The Science Museum didn't have a site in London. This engine shed had just been closed by the BR board, and it was offered up and thereby became the home of the National Railway Collection and became the National Museum, and was opened in 1975 on the same day as the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in 1825. So they liked that bit of symmetry when it was opened in 1975. The building we're stood in now was originally York's number 4 engine shed. There were 2 turntables, only one of those now remains, and it would have operated 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, cleaning and preparing locomotives and sending them to work at York Station to run the daily services that operated in and out of York. So it is a very historic place. There is another section. We refer to it as the Station Hall because it's done out as an Edwardian station would have been. It's where the Royal Trains live and some of our dining trains, and it's where the museum's main restaurant is. But it was originally what was called the Sundries Goods Depot, which was basically the place where personal parcels, small deliveries were brought together by train and then dispatched out into the city of York and the surrounding villages. So when people ordered a pair of slippers or a barrel of whiskey or whatever, it would arrive at the Sundries Goods Depot by goods train and then be sent out, usually by horse-drawn carts, because in those days the railways were the largest users of horse-drawn transport in the UK. Britain's story is intimately bound up with the development and the evolution of the railway industry. So this is part of Britain's story with a railway focus. We've got all the icons of railway history here. We have Stephenson's rocket, both working and in replica cutaway. We've got probably the 2 most famous trains in the country. Mallard has a special place because it's the world's fastest steam locomotive. In July 1938, it ran at 126 miles an hour, briefly, set a world speed record, and basically, of course, with the Second World War breaking out soon after that, no one else got a chance to come back at them, so the record has stayed ever since. Nobody else has built a steam engine that's travelled at that speed, so it's a world record holder.
In 2004, the National Railway Museum acquired the legendary Flying Scotsman locomotive, famous for being the first steam engine to officially travel at 100 miles an hour. It was saved for the nation following a massive public appeal amid fears that the Doncaster-built icon would be sold abroad. Visitors today see it in pieces in the museum's workshop.
Flying Scotsman is currently going over a severe restoration so that in 2010 it can take back to the main line in steaming and do what it was designed to do, run people around the rail network in fine fettle. It's probably the most famous locomotive in the country, I would say. And of course it survived because of that fame. It was through ordinary people giving their money to help the National Railway Museum purchase it for the nation, so it's now part of the collection. I think people are fascinated by railways because there's a whole mix of things. There's a nostalgia for a golden age, the world of Poirot and all that, beautiful trains, gleaming brass. There's also the memories of older people. There's a sense of travel. When you go by train, it's a sense of occasion, a sense of journey. There's the wonder of the royalty associated with railways. It's just a marvellous combination of things all put together, from the excitement of big engineering and solid things to the personal pleasures of going on a journey.